Good evening, everybody. Just a bit of admin before we start the formal part of the meeting. There are no fire alarms scheduled for this evening. Therefore, if the fire alarm sounds, please evacuate the building immediately. The fire exit is located at the rear of this room. Go down the stairs and meet in the War Memorial Park. Please note this meeting is being webcast live on the internet. We're live currently, and the webcast will also be published on YouTube after the meeting. Please can all members and the public switch their phones off or to silent. For the benefit of the members of the public attending, I would like to explain who everybody is around this table. My name is Councillor Paul Miller, and I'm the chairman of this committee. Down the sides of the table, to my left and right, are councillors who sit on this committee and will be making the decisions on the applications before us this evening. Immediately to my left and right are the officers who will be advising councillors. In addition, I'd like to explain that the Development Control Committee is a regulatory committee and not a political meeting. The committee will be examining the evidence brought before us tonight and will make decisions based on planning reasons. We are guided by national and local planning policy and guidance. May I ask all speakers, including visiting members, to speak clearly and to return to their seats once their presentation is complete and following any questions from members of the committee. No further dialogue between members of the committee and speakers will be permitted once questioning is finished. May I ask all committee members to avoid repetition and to keep any comments on each planning item to a maximum of 4 minutes. I understand that planning can be emotive, and I ask that everybody remains polite and professional throughout this evening. Right, it's just after 6:30 and we'll commence the meeting. Item number 1 on the agenda is apologies for absence and substitutions. I note we have Councillor Paul Harvey in place of Councillor Tomlin. Are there any other resignations? And I would like to also welcome Councillor Court back to the committee after her fairly long absence one way and another with her health problems. Very good to see you on your feet, if I can add that. Any declarations of interest, items on the agenda tonight? There are none. There are no urgent matters under item 3. And the minutes of the meeting held on the 21st of January 2020 will be approved at the next Development Control Committee on the 11th of March. Go on to item 5, which is applications for planning permission. And we'll go through the update paper in conjunction with the reports. And we'll go for item number 1. And I'd like to invite Ms. Banks and Mr. Paul Beavers to come forward, please. Good evening. If you'd just like to sit tight and the officers will introduce the application.
Thank you, Chairman. So this application is for the change of use of land to Forest School, including the provision of associated parking. The application is recommended for refusal for the 2 reasons set out on page 17 of the agenda. If I can just draw members' attention to the update page, starting on page 1. There's a brief summary there from the viewing panel when members visited the site. Also, it's been confirmed that the site area is 6.4 acres or 2.6 hectares. Also, it has been confirmed on that viewing panel meeting by the applicant that activities would extend beyond the existing tracks. The applicant has also confirmed that no additional hardstanding is to be constructed. Just moving on, there are comments provided there by the officer, commenting on further information submitted by the applicant. An additional letter of representation has been received, and that is summarised on page 2. It's confirmed that Councillor Bound has supported the proposal, as stated there. And there's also clarification on the remit of the biodiversity officer's comments provided there. And below that it says officer comment, and the officer addresses within this section further comments that have been raised since the agenda was published. And they go on to the next page as well. So just to clarify, the application is recommended for refusal as per the reasons set out on page 17 of the agenda. Thank you.
And just for the record, you mentioned that Councillor Bound has supported the application. That's Councillor Simon Bound, who's a portfolio holder, and not Councillor Mike Bound, who sits on this committee. You have, well, but between you, Ms Banks and Mr Beavers, you have 4 minutes between you. Off you go.
Thank you, councillors, for giving me the time to speak this evening. I am Lizzie from Muddy Puddle Club Community Interest Company. I've been a forest school leader and trainer working in a variety of outdoor spaces, including ancient woodlands, for the past 12 years. We've been looking for a suitable woodland in this area for the past 4 years. The site needs to be close to Basingstoke and the surrounding villages and have parking and hard standing to make it accessible for children and adults with physical and special educational needs. Unlike other sites we've considered, Pensdale Woods offers all of this. And additionally, we pride ourselves on choosing sites where we can go beyond sustainability and actively restore biodiversity. The overwhelming presence of rhododendron in these woodlands means that all the work we do to manage and remove this invasive species as part of our programmes will reach that aim for going beyond sustainability and actually enhance and recover this woodland. We would use the space to provide forest school sessions which use play, managed risk-taking and child-centred strategies to connect learners with nature, including managing woodland spaces, creating and protecting habitats, conserving nature whilst forging lifelong emotional connections with the natural world. How can we ask people to protect our woodlands and nature if they have no direct experience of it? We would also lead woodland management volunteer days and training, provide CPD in forest school and play approaches, and we will also deliver targeted programmes on mental health alongside play therapists. I am also qualified to provide a range of accredited outdoor learning vocational training courses for young people, adults and those with special educational needs. The planning report claims that running forest school on this site will cause significant harm to the woodland. However, despite offering the biodiversity officer numerous site visits, they have not actually been to the site and assessed the woodland firsthand. But the recommendation is based on that objection. Conversely, Natural England also reviewed the plans and stated that there would be no significant adverse impact to the conservation site or landscape. They had no objection. A woodland surveyor from the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors produced a preliminary woodland management plan with detailed information about the trees. The tree officer did not comment on these details. I argue that the woodland will benefit enormously from our work there, supported by the local community who are already champions of biodiversity. I also argue that consideration should be given to the impact of our long-term forest school programmes, which are proven to increase nature connectedness in children, and the impact that this will have on the wider communities and, as a result, their attitudes towards protecting the environment throughout their lives. Consideration should also be given to the sustainability, environmental, social and economical that this type of use offers. Thank you. Paul.
Thank you. Uncharacteristically, I shall be very brief.
You've got 1 minute.
Informal learning through play in woodlands does not require planning permission. This proposal delivers an absolutely essential life skill. The difference arising from supervision of this essential skill is surely so trivial as not to merit the need for planning permission, or at worst, it deserves to be approved unreservedly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Members, any questions of the applicant? Councillor Robinson.
Thank you, Chair. Could you tell us how often you'll use the woods, how many people you'll be taking into the woods? You know, will you be in there weekly, monthly? What sort of footfall you'll be having in there?
Sorry, could you use your microphone, please?
Yeah.
I don't have a copy in front of me, but the planning consultant put through a condition, which was that we would only be using it for a limited number of hours per, I think it's per month or per week. It's in, I wish I had it in front of me right now. At the start, when we first start using the site, I envisage us using it for approximately 5 hours per week throughout the year to start with.
Councillor George.
Very quickly, I think during this site visit you suggested you may try and use this wood in a phased approach. Now, given that you've got 2.6 hectares or what have you, is that your intention to take it, or are you going to use the whole of the area, or are you going to take it in pieces and then allow that to recover and then move on? Is that your intention, please?
As you saw when we went on the site visit, the site is completely covered in rhododendron, so there's very little soil, there's a very little field layer basically within the woodlands remaining. It's been damaged by the rhododendron. We cannot just use the whole woodland, it would be impossible for a start, but also obviously we're taking children into the woods. So the intention would be to use this very small area and work on clearing that area of the rhododendron, maintaining that, encouraging the biodiversity to return to that area, and then if the woodland manager feels it is appropriate, at that point we will move on. So normally if we work in ancient woodlands, we keep our site to an area which has already had footfall damage, so for example from another environmental centre being ran there before. But in this case it's quite different because the rhododendron covers everywhere. We need to actually be in different locations in order to start managing that rhododendron cover. So yeah, we won't be covering the whole woodland, absolutely not, very small area.
Councillor McCormick.
Yes, just picking up on that. So rhododendron, as I understand, is a Himalayan invasive species. So on this particular site, what is the potential adverse impact to the ancient woodland? You're ripping out an invasive species. Is there any other work and any other impacts that's going to come of that?
The impacts will only be positive. By removing rhododendron, you give the chance the ground to recover. So rhododendron doesn't just affect the soil, it also affects the trees. So what we will have to do is very carefully remove the rhododendron, essentially from one patch at a time, see what is there, see what is still underneath it, what is living within it, which probably is very little, look at the tree's condition, and then move one patch at a time. There is no adverse effect to removing rhododendron.
Councillor Bound.
Thank you. Good evening. What sort of ratio will it be between your sort of the staff and your clients, the children?
That really depends on the session. So at the moment we run, for example, parent and toddler sessions, and on average an adult will come with one child. So that would be 10 adults, 10 children coming in one time. But then another example might be, for example, our programmes which target mental health. That would be just adults coming in, so probably 5 or 6 adults coming with 2 leaders. And then if we were bringing children in without adults there, say for us, and perhaps a school was visiting, we work with lots of schools in the local area who can come across the bridge. It's very close to a bridge from Basingstoke Town Centre. If they were coming, they would be coming 15 children at a time and having 3 forest school leaders with them.
Any more questions, members? Councillor Potter.
Hello, Mr. Banks. I think you partly covered it. I just wanted to clarify. You talked, I think, about your activities being supported by the local community. And I know you've made mention, obviously, of the parents of the children, which is good. What else might it mean in terms of organised sessions?
Actually, Paul, you could probably answer that a little bit because Paul actually lives within the local community.
I hadn't thought that far, but certainly we've got the school, we've got quite a lot of children in the village in that respect. It's so convenient a place. But of course, Clidston's very close to the town anyway, so to try and draw a distinction in this case between the town and ourselves, which is only separated by the M3, it's a bit difficult to do that, really.
Is that okay? Are we still on?
Yes, you are.
So we would also hope to work with, in Clidston, they have a, what do you call your group? Wild Clidston Biodiversity.
3CG.
3CG, they have a name.
Yeah.
So 3CG, we've already spoken to them and they would like to actively become involved with working in this project to actually make sure we are doing a good job of biodiversity in their local area. But I would also like to work with local community groups as well. There's in Audley's Wood Hotel, which literally backs onto the woodland, there's a resource centre for adults with learning difficulties. So we'd like to work with them as well. There's Also, lots of schools on the other side of the bridge who I already work with, providing forest school training, and they would like to, as part of their long-term forest school programs, make visits to the woodland. But I'm the reason we looked for this woodland in the first place is because the other ancient woodland that we already use, which is in Bramley Frith, we do not want to use it any more than we already do, because we want to make sure we are going beyond sustainability there as well. And I don't want to have more sessions in that woodland. It's just not, it's not sustainable.
Councillor Harvey.
Just picking up the point about obviously the species that are there that are perhaps, as already been said to, not supposed to be in the first place. One of the key things in terms of ancient woodland is native shrubs and native trees. Would it be your intention that were you to clear the area to reintroduce native species to the area, therefore improving it?
That is our fundamental aim of using this woodland. We would like to restore the woodland back to the ancient woodland status that it has. Going into that woodland, did you come along on the site visit? I'm sure the others can say, when you go into that woodland, it is absolutely overwhelming how much rhododendron is in that woodland. It's come from Audley's Wood ground, so it's just spread into the woodland. And just to give you an example, rhododendron clearing is extremely expensive. The Peak District did a huge project on it. It cost them about £3 billion in order to clear the rhododendron, in order to try and get this back. What we're offering is to, as part of our work, manage this and clear this whilst we are there. So the way we see it is, this isn't separate to the woodland management plan. This is part of the woodland management plan. By being there every single week, twice a week, we are actually going to be able to actively manage that rhododendron and actively encourage species to return. I don't just work on my own with this. We have plenty of rangers we work with as well who will be able to advise on that. So we have worked with rangers at the Vine National Trust with their ancient woodland. We work there all the time. And they have a lovely group called Thrive, who are a gardening charity, and we can work with them and bring their work, because I know them already. We can bring them over, and I also work with rangers in Bramley Frith as well. So we're not just doing this on this own. My expertise is in forest school, but as part of being a forest school trainer, I do woodland management for my trainees, and I train people to go beyond sustainability and choose the correct spaces.
Can I just add one simple point, Councillor Harvey? Basically, natural regeneration will start to replace the rhododendron, and we should be encouraging that as much as anything.
But only if we manage it.
Right, thank you very much indeed. Councillor Raffel. Councillor, good evening.
Good evening, Chairman. Thank you for allowing me to address the meeting. The arguments for promoting this as an educational facility, I would submit, are unassailable, and I hope you accept that. But I want to tackle the biodiversity objection, the only objection, in fact, to this application. No doubt because of its status and designation, it would appear, or it's coming across as though, the woodland is being given some special status, being put on a pedestal as a prime example in the borough of ancient woodland, almost as if it has regained some form of ancient woodland virginity, having not been touched by man for a long time. Well, I have to say that is completely undocumented. There is no evidence as to when it was last touched by man or what its status was last week, last month, last year, last decade, last century. And as a consequence of that, one thing you can probably assume fairly safely is that it is actually the product of man's intervention that's created it in the way it is. Its shape, its fencing, the species that have been allowed to grow in there, the trees that have previously been cut down, and the ones that have been allowed to thrive. And that takes us on to another important point, that harm itself is being used in this objection as though it is some objective concept, when in fact what is one person's harm in biodiversity could be another person's good. So in the concept or what we're dealing with in this proposal is the potential to remove rhododendron. an invasive species that is well known to be contrary to ancient woodland and needs to be removed. You remove it, and you release light to the woodland floor, which encourages flowers to bloom for a period of time, seedlings to germinate, and new trees to grow, which are just resting there whilst the rhododendron is there. But of course, on the downside, the rhododendron could be protection for deer in the ancient woodland and pheasants and ground nesting birds. So there are what on one person might say is harm, other people may say is good, but that is just the way biodiversity is and the way we manage biodiversity. So I would ask you all to accept that there isn't, as it were, an objective harm in this, that the mere trespass of a human being into that woodland is somehow going to upset the ecological balance, but instead say that the proposal to manage the woodland is a good thing and would actually serve to enhance and conserve it for the future. And of course, combine that with the educational facility would provide a win-win situation, not just for the woodland, but for our future generations from around Basingstoke who will be visiting it.
1 minute.
So I'm asking you to support the application.
Thank you, Councillor. Questions for Councillor Ruffell? Councillor McCormack.
Craving your indulgence, have you got any planning reasons and policy quotations we might use as possible reasons for approval?
I think this is about judgment on potential harm. And I think it's within policy for you to say that we don't accept that the harm is, that there either is going to be harm, or we accept that the benefits as you outweigh them of the improvement to the woodland would outweigh the potential harm, say, to the rhododendron or the trespass by man, albeit that the trespass by man is continuous and can exist. The landowner can trample all over it tomorrow if he wishes. That's the irony of the whole thing. So I think you're just going to say that if you want to approve it, you can say that you've evaluated the potential harm to biodiversity and you don't believe it to be so strong that it cannot be approved. But I dare say the officers, bear in mind, we have the head of planning here, will assist you with the wording.
And Councillor McCormack, there's much more a question to the officers as opposed to a speaker, albeit we know the speaker's background in planning. Thank you very much for your contribution, Councillor Ruffell. Questions to officers? Councillor McCormack.
I guess we'll be addressing the planning reasons in due course, but just looking on page 21, and we've got biodiversity objection, trees objection, but nothing on the papers, and I'm struggling to find anything on the update papers. Do we have anything material from those consultees as to why it is they're objecting other than it potentially harms ancient woodland?
Yeah. The consultees' comments are set out on full on the planning file, and within the relevant sections of the report, the officer summarises the comments made by the various consultees. So, for example, the biodiversity officer's comments are summarised from page 25 onwards, and that covers the issues that have been raised by the biodiversity officer.
Councillor Robinson.
Thank you, Chair. In the report, it cites EM1 and EM4 as reasons for refusal. Could you tell me exactly which policies in EM1 and EM4? We've got A to H on EM1 and A to F on EM4. Which of those do you feel does it fail?
Sorry, just give me 1 second. So in terms of policy EM4, it is point 1 D, which says will be no harm to locally designated sites, including sites of importance for nature conservation, which is a sink, and also E, which is there will be no loss or degradation of a key habitat type, including irreplaceable habitats, which ancient woodland is. It was to do with EM1. So EM1 relates to the trees themselves. Let me just see if the report states. So yeah, on page 30 of the agenda, under the tree section, the officer refers to principle T1, which is in the supplementary planning document. So I think they've said that's the reason. And also, yeah, in regards to point B and point E of policy EM1, which is set out, so the visual amenity and scenic quality, and also trees, ancient woodland, hedgerows, in terms of what is likely to be affected.
Thank you. No more debate? Councillor Robinson.
Thank you, Chair. Looking at the reasons for refusal, we've just got EM1B, that it will have particular regard to the visual amenity and scenic quality of the area. What I saw over there was a piece of woodland that was in absolutely dreadful condition, had very little visual amenity and not a lot of scenic quality. So I think it will improve that. And very much the same, I think it does have regard on EM1E. It will bring back the ancient woodland. It will get rid of the invasive species. There's no water features, no rivers, no particular other landscape features. So I disagree that it fails on EM1. On EM4, B, it says there should be no adverse impact on the integrity of the designated proposed site. I don't think it will have an adverse effect on it. I think it will have a positive effect on it. And on E, no loss or deterioration of key habitat. Well, I don't think rhododendron is a key habitat, so removing the rhododendron isn't going to have a bad effect on there. The speaker earlier spoke that she looks after Bramley Frith. Obviously, that's in my ward. I know Bramley Frith very, very well. It's a beautiful place to go for a walk. It's a beautiful place to go for a ride. It's well managed. This piece of woodland is not well managed. It's not managed at all, and it's in dreadful condition. And if we go to EM4, number 2, it says there is an overriding need, public need for the proposal, which outweighs the need to safeguard the biodiversity. Educating children in matters of biodiversity, I think with the climate emergency that we've got here and around the world, is an overriding need. So on that basis and with those reasons, I propose we should accept this and pass this planning application. Thank you.
And that is a proposal for approval. It's been proposed. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Court. Do you wish to say anything at this stage?
I'd just like to say a few words. I grew up many years ago now, and I actually had full access to the countryside, climbed trees and everything, and the benefit that gave me. Unfortunately, we now have a generation that's grown up with handheld computers, mobile phones, and I see a lot of children with forest schools in our locality now, and they just love it, and it fosters that understanding of nature. And I'd like to agree with Councillor Robinson and second the motion.
Thank you. I'll come back to the other two councillors in a minute, but it's been properly moved and seconded for the reasons provided by Councillor Robinson to approve this application for approval. All those in favour? That's approved. Officers?
Okay, just to confirm, as per Councillor Robinson's comments, the application would improve the scenic quality. There'd be no adverse effect or loss of habitat in accordance with policy EM1 and EM4. And also in regards to EM4.2, the public need would outweigh the harm in this case and the need to safeguard it. So I've got some suggested conditions that I can run through.
Please continue.
Yeah. So the development shall be carried out in accordance with the approved plans. The development shall be begun before 3 years. An ecological appraisal shall be submitted. A wildlife protection and mitigation plan to be submitted. A woodland management plan, including enhancement and management, to be submitted. A biodiversity monitoring strategy to be submitted. Should I mention the use in terms of the time frame, or should they haven't mentioned it? So should I just?
Well, no, you might mention. Did they mention it on the viewing?
I'm just wondering, it was mentioned on the viewing that members, it was brought up by the applicant in terms of a time frame for the permission where it can be reviewed after a number of years. That hasn't been discussed.
It wasn't part of the proposal.
Yeah, that's fine. And then a condition securing the number of hours per week and the hours of the day that the use can be operating.
That's fine. You're content? Yeah. Thank you very much, Councillor Robertson. Thank you, officers. Move on to item number 2. There are no speakers to this, so I will ask the members questions to officers. Oh, you didn't introduce it. Sorry. We always need speakers. Triggered it off. Please introduce it.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So this is an application for the conversion of a garage into a one-bedroom unit. If I bring to your attention the viewing panel report on the update paper, also clarification of the pre-commencement conditions have been agreed by the applicant agent, and also clarification in terms of the ability to turn within the site on the land that's edged in blue, which is still under the applicant's control. So the officer's recommendation is for approval.
Right, questions to officers? Nope. Debate? Councillor Potter.
Fairly straightforwardly, I think, to say, Chair, if I may, I mean, having gone on the viewing, I'm supportive of the application, and when I looked at it in the context of the appearance of the building as it is and what it will be after fairly minor amendments, I could see no problem with that, no contradiction. And in regard to the matter of parking, where the facility will be proposed, will it exist as part of this proposal, and the officer has just confirmed really that we're content, I think, that consistent with the normal arrangements we require of being able to turn within the curtilage of the dwelling itself, or certainly within land that comes within that ownership. I think those are satisfied, and really and truly I think it's a commendable application. I'd propose its approval.
And a seconder? Councillor Harvey. Proposed and seconded for approval. All those in favour? Okay. And that's approved, officers.
Thank you, Chair, that the application be approved subject to the conditions on in the officer's report.
Move on to item number 3. And again, no speakers. If the officers could present this application.
Yep. So, thank you, Chair. This application is for the erection of a part 2-storey, part single-storey side extensions following the demolition of an existing garage. The application is recommended for approval, subject to the conditions at the end of the report. There's no update to report on this one. Thank you.
Right, committee, unless anybody has anything to say on this application, I will move it from the chair for approval. May I have a seconder? Councillor Robinson. Moved and seconded for approval. All those in favour? That's carried. Officers?
Yep, so that application is approved, subject to the conditions listed at the end of the report.
Thank you. Item number 4. Could I ask Ms. Miles to come forward, please? Good evening, and if you'd like to sit tight, and we'll get the officers to introduce the application.
Thank you, Chair. This is an application for the demolition of Knights Farmhouse and the associated outbuildings and storage buildings, and the erection of 3 detached dwellings. Members viewed the site, and the viewing panel report is on the update paper, together with confirmation that the pre-commencement conditions have been agreed with the agent, and also just confirmation that the site access to the site is an existing farm access which sits to the south of the existing site that you would have driven into when you did the viewing. The officer's recommendation is for approval.
Thank you. And Catherine, you've got 4 minutes.
Thank you, and good evening, councillors. Knights Farm comprises a principal farmhouse with a range of outbuildings and some B8 commercial storage buildings. The site is accessed off Knights Lane and is to the north of Ball Hill. There's agricultural land to the north and east of the site, and there are neighbouring dwellings to the south and west. To the east of the farmhouse is a group of 9 buildings which benefit from a lawful class B8 storage use. Full planning permission was granted by the council for the demolition of those commercial buildings and the erection of 4 dwellings, and that development is due to commence later this year. The principal farmhouse and its outbuildings are in a poor state of repair. We approached officers for pre-application advice last year and were advised that the footprint of the existing buildings would be considered previously developed land. Concern was raised at that time that the proposed layout, which was linear, wouldn't be acceptable, but officers confirmed that the applicant's view that the site was not an isolated location and is unlikely to be of high environmental value. After careful consideration of those pre-application comments, this application was submitted for the erection of 3 dwellings. The design ethos is to reflect a traditional farm courtyard, with the dwellings purposefully designed to appear as a group taking on board the comments of your officers. Each dwelling is individually designed with traditional features and taking a cue from the Eastwood Village design statement. The scheme proposes 1 5-bed, 1 4-bed and 1 3-bedroom dwelling, which is reflective of the local housing mix. We're aware of the Parish Council's objection to the housing mix. The Parish Council's comments referred to a need for more homes for those looking to downsize. We consider that a 3-bedroom unit, which has a gross internal area of approximately 135 square metres, and the small 4-bedroom unit, which has a GIA of 185, are small units and do meet that need and reflect the size and scale of properties in this locality. We support your officer's recommendation that the site is not isolated due to the visual connection with the village of Ball Hill and the fact that the site is situated along a lane which has a distinctive residential character. The site is also viewed in the context of existing residential development. We consider that the proposal would result in a notable visual enhancement due to the removal of the existing unattractive commercial buildings and the tired out buildings. Whilst the main house has some attractive features, it's really beyond economical repair. The proposed erection of 3 high-quality new homes compatible with the rural environment is supported by officers who conclude that the proposal would not have a significant impact on the landscape character and scenic quality of this part of the AONB. Through the proposed landscaping scheme and detailed design, the limited impact can be successfully mitigated. We note the concerns of local residents regarding the suitability of Knights Lane to accommodate additional traffic. We note those concerns are not shared by council officers. Visibility displays are achieved at the access. onto Knights Lane, and sufficient parking is provided on site to serve the development. The proposed dwellings are in any event likely to generate less traffic than the former farm use, and certainly less traffic than a B8 storage use if it was fully operational.
Yeah,
And the
1
type
minute.
of vehicles, thank you, is also different. In concluding, the proposed development seeks to make efficient use of previously developed land in a location which is agreed as not being isolated. The proposals accord with paragraph 78 of the framework and make a modest contribution to the local housing stock. The proposal is considered to enhance the site's appearance and the contribution it makes to the character of the area, and would result in no adverse impact on the AONB. There are no concerns raised by officers in relation to landscape trees or ecology matters, and in any event, planning conditions are recommended to control suitable mitigation. Overall, we consider the proposal does accord with your development plan and should accordingly be approved. Thank you. Happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. Members, any questions for the applicant? Nope. Thank you very much. Councillor Saunders. You have 4 minutes, sir.
Good evening, members. Good evening, Chair. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on this application. I've noted the objections from local residents and from the parish. And it is true that this is a site which is down a single track lane that can at times be difficult to navigate when you get traffic going both ways. It is at least a third of a mile from the nearest bus stop and a half mile to the garage, and even further to the pub along unlit roads with no footpath, making its sustainability questionable. And it is bordered by farmland in an area outside of any settlement policy boundary. And I think the other key point which is made by those objectors is that the ward, and indeed the general area, is not really in need of more 4 and 5 bedroom houses, whether they are big or small 4 bedroom houses. However, if you've been to the site or you've seen the photographs up there, the place is a tip. It's an eyesore. It is a blot on the landscape. I could go on and it'd probably upset the owner. But it is indisputable that I think it's fallen into a state of disrepair to the extent of which it would be questionable whether anyone would want to take on the restoration of the farmhouse as a single unit. It just would not be economically sensible to do so. There's already permission granted for 4 dwellings on the adjacent site, and highways consider the minor increase in traffic as acceptable, even though others might query whether highways necessarily have the right perspective in this matter. But adequate conditions could be applied to protect biodiversity, trees, the environment, and therefore my view is that on balance, the improvement that will be brought to the area from the redevelopment of this site would be a positive benefit, and therefore I'm happy to support officers' recommendations.
Thank you, Councillor. Members, any questions for the ward member? Nope. Thank you very much. Questions to officers? Councillor Bound.
Yeah, I noticed in the report that the applicant is applying for SIL exemptions. I mean, on what basis is that being put forward for exemption?
To be honest, I can't tell you the details. It's not something that would affect you in determining the application. It's if they've put through, it's a separate process basically through the SIL process. They put through an exemption now, and then as and when they start work on the site, then we will serve various notices on them, and they're allowed to then put in exemptions. We just refer to it here. Sometimes they give us that information now, but it's not really relevant at this stage in the planning process.
And yet it's mentioned in the planning report, so I just wondered why there wasn't any discussion about it.
No more questions? Debate? Councillor Leeks.
I'd like to move the recommendation, Chairman.
Oh, it's Councillor Bound first. Councillor Bound.
I will speak on it briefly. Yes, I agree with Councillor Sanders. On our site visits, certainly it looks to me as though something needs to be done with the site. But I'm taken by the objections of the parish council there, in that there is no housing need for large houses, apparently, in Ball Hill. They want 2 and 3 bedroom houses. And we've got, whatever is it, three or four large bedroom houses on this location. They haven't provided evidence that it's previously developed land, from what I could see within the report, except for the curtilage outside the buildings. So it doesn't meet the housing need. There's a question about previously developed land. There's also a question, I think, about, and Councillor Sanders mentioned it himself, about there aren't that many facilities in the area. And whilst the highways are not particularly objecting, there are going to be a lot more traffic movements along that narrow lane, and being such large buildings, they're probably going to have quite a number of vehicles, and I don't think it's going to particularly develop the local, affect the local community economically in a beneficial way. I mean, they're more likely to go to Newbury to do their shopping and so on. So whilst we come up against a 5-year housing land supply problem, and I don't see any way around that, I think if it come forward when we did have a 5-year housing land supply, it will be a different matter altogether.
Councillor McCormack, did I understand you wanted to second the proposal?
Yes, Chair.
Thank you very much. It's been proposed and seconded for approval. All those in favour? Any against? One abstention? Yep. Okay. Thank you very much. That's carried. Officers?
Thank you to confirm that the application has been approved subject to the conditions in the officer's report.
Thank you. And item number 5, land in Charter Alley. Councillor Greaves, please. Good evening, Councillor. If you'd just like to sit tight until the officers present the application.
Thank you, Chairman. So this application is for the change of use of land to equestrian for the keeping of horses and keeping and riding of horses for a private use, together with the erection of associated stables and hay store. The application is recommended for approval as set out on page 97 of the agenda. Just to draw members' attention to the update page, there's a brief summary there of the viewing panel. Also below that, there's confirmation that the pre-commencement conditions have been agreed by the applicant, and also the planning agent has confirmed that there would be no impact on any tree roots as a result of the development. Also further comments from Wootton St Lawrence Parish Council confirming their objection, which is set out in full in the officer's report. And additionally, a further letter of objection has been received, and the contents of that have been covered within the officer's report. So just to confirm, the application is recommended for approval.
Thank you. Councillor, you have 4 minutes. Microphone, that's the button on the base there. That's it.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. I'd like to speak to you on behalf of Wootton St Lawrence Parish Council. I'll be reinforcing our previous concerns on this application, which we feel have not been adequately addressed. These are based around the long-term management and care of horses, as well as the site itself. I have 15 years professional yard experience and own 2 horses myself. The application demonstrates inadequate knowledge of equine facilities operations. The proposed development, especially the limited acreage, falls well short of the minimum provision for 8 horses in guidance issued by the British Horse Society. Even with restricted turnout, i.e. daily use of stables, and good field management, their maximum for this site would be 3 horses. The applicant states that grazing will be supplemented with feed. This is actually true for all horses kept in the UK, as grass stops growing from about March until from November until March. Feeding is essential, but the impact of increased feeding is as follows. Environmental field management becomes essential with intensive grazing to maintain the soil and grass root structure. Dividing up available grazing and preventing poaching in wet weather and removing all manure. The application does not mention this. The more time horses are kept inside stables, the more feed and manure will be needed and created. One stabled horse will create approximately 210 kilograms of manure every week. Deliveries of food and bedding will also increase. If the barn is used to store manure before removal, space to store food and bedding will also be reduced, increasing HGV deliveries to the site. Normally, a private yard means one run by a single individual for their own horses. If used by individuals of 4 families, financial and operational management would be far more complex. Whatever the arrangement, it would be a livery stable de facto and very disruptive to many residents in close proximity. From personal experience of DIY livery yards, I can inform you that the management of this yard could be horrendous. The peak hour traffic increased due to the daily comings and goings of at least 4 separate owners, horses moving to off-site grazing, deliveries, removals of manure, farriers and vets will be bad enough. The smell of the muck on road could be intolerable. Water management, especially runoff, has not been properly addressed. The stables, manure storage and the used pasture will all produce extra nitrates.
You have 1 minute.
There is no plan to limit these leaching into the soil or being diverted into the wastewater system. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Just sit tight, see if we've got any questions for you. From the Parish Council, Councillor Harvey.
Thank you. You referenced the BHS guidelines and their importance in this. Obviously, you're a professional in the area. Could you advise us as the council, from your point of view as a professional in the area, how we should take note of those guidelines?
Those guidelines, looking at the acreage that each horse needs to be a proper horse and for the fields to be managed. This site is creating the availability for over twice the amount of horses for available acreage on that site. I think that's how you should view it.
No more questions? Councillor Potter.
I think it probably relates to the same sort of thing, although I'm certainly no expert on the welfare of horses. But when we looked at the field in question, it seemed to be strewn with flints. The surface was pretty substantially covered in flints, which I wouldn't have thought was ideal for horses. But I would welcome your comments on that, really, and whether such a field could be cleared in any case to make it what I'd describe as a reasonable pasture area. I don't know very much about that, but it certainly didn't seem very good to me.
You're absolutely correct, Councillor, is that would be a major safety issue. Even small amounts of flints, anyone who owns a dog knows as well that they can very easily cut themselves. They tend to be quite difficult abrasions. And flints will always break. So if you have a horse, especially with shoes on, that hits a large flint, you're then going to create 10 small ones. The only way to pick them up is to go out by hand. And I can tell you, as someone who started as a 12-year-old on a yard, that's what you get the kids to do. So it would, but if it's a family running the yard, they also need to spend an hour poo picking and an hour picking up flints. And over that large site, the more the horses use it, the more flints will be created from the ground. And you can tell by the fields around us, which have been used for agriculture, the more you plough them, which is essentially what horses do with their feet, the more you bring up flints. So it would be a never-ending issue.
No more questions. Thank you very much. Could I ask Mr. Bowen to come forward, please? Good evening, Mr. Bowen. You have 4 minutes, and you've found the microphone.
Good evening, everybody. I speak on behalf of all of those that are in opposition to this, of which we've got a number of families represented here this evening. Councillor Greaves has spoken about some of the husbandry issues, and I'm going to focus particularly on the issues around access and increased traffic and the implications that will have on the village, and on some of the other environmental impacts that I don't believe have been taken into account fully. So the first point on access and traffic, as you will have seen at your site visits, the access to this is at a already very dangerous junction. It is accessing White Hart Lane, which is recognised in the signage already there that it is unsuitable for heavy goods vehicles. The turning left onto Monk Sherborne Road is a blind junction that, as I've said, is already a dangerous junction. Unquestionably, with this number of horses that are being proposed, there will be an increase in traffic. And that is only going to make this dangerous junction more dangerous. And I don't believe that has factored into the 7-metre adjustment that's been suggested. Second point is that actually there is insufficient infrastructure in the village to take account of an increase in traffic. As we've heard, with 4 families accessing the site, daily clearing of waste and other husbandry requirements, that there is going to be that increase in traffic. The village, by nature of being very close to a good local primary school, is made up of lots of young families who are regularly walking on the road. It's a dangerous situation that's been brought to the council's attention before, and this will make it worse. There is no question that this will make it worse. So it will make the situation more dangerous. The village is not equipped for a development of this scale and scope. Third point, in terms of the looking at some of the environmental impacts, the report that you've got in front of you states that there would not be a harmful visual impact on the character of the area, with 3 new buildings, one of which is 7 metres high. I do not believe can be visually anchored by a small number of trees and a very low hedgerow. So I just don't think that has been considered fully. It's in counter to, I believe, the policy in the local plan, policy EM1, that states that developments must respect and enhance, not be detrimental to the character or visual amenity of the landscape, particularly referencing trees and hedgerows. And I don't believe that has been picked up fully in the report that was put to you.
Yeah, 1 minute.
The final point on impact picks up some of the things that have been said already, but particularly I want you to be aware that we are in a nitrate vulnerable area. Some of you may be aware of that already. And so all of the leaching of the waste materials has, again, I don't believe has been assessed properly through the report that you've got access to. I might be wrong. And finally, for those of you that are aware of the local area, we know that there are adders, a protected species, I understand, that are cited fairly regularly there. And again, my understanding is that requires a full environmental assessment that has not been done so far.
Thank you very much. Could you put your microphone off, please? Thanks. It's just it mutes everybody else out, not mine. Questions to the speaker? Nope. Thank you very much. Mr. Jarman, please. Councillor Harvey.
Just bearing in mind what the gentleman has just raised in terms of the nitrates issue, I need to declare an interest on that basis, and I'm going to leave the room just to be on the safe side. Something that's part of my work life that I am doing in another part of the county, and I don't want to cross over, so I'm going to just leave the room.
Fair enough. Yeah, okay. Fair enough, Councillor Harvey. Good evening, Mr. Jarman. You have 4 minutes. And your microphone switch is at the base there. That's it.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. This is a modest proposal for 2 small stable blocks and a hay barn to be used privately by a group of family members who already have joint ownership of the field. Whilst the site is in a countryside location, the keeping of horses is not unfamiliar in this locality, and you only have to look to the north of the field to see other equestrian facilities. I also understand the application site itself has been used in the past for the keeping of horses. In short, the proposed equestrian use is in keeping with the rural surroundings. I nevertheless note that there has been concerns expressed by some of the local community. However, my opinion is that this relates more to fears about rumoured plans for the site rather than the actual proposals. For the avoidance of doubt, there is every intention to construct and use the stables and barns, and it goes without saying that any other development could not simply happen because of this proposal, as planning permission would be required. Based on this case, we agree with the case officer's assessment that the proposal is of an appropriate design and relates to the surrounding development in a sympathetic manner. Indeed, there is an existing barn on the neighbouring land which is located close to the position of the proposed buildings, and there are also further rural buildings in the land to the north. Turning to concerns expressed about the size of the field, it's important to note that the horses will not be wholly reliant on the land for grazing as they were giving feed to ensure their dietary needs are fulfilled. My client also owns around 17 acres of land within half a mile of the site, which can also be used for riding and exercising, etc. The field already has a main supply of water and any waste products will be removed from the site and used as organic fertiliser on agricultural land, also in my client's ownership. I'd also like to reassure the committee that the proposal is not for any commercial operation, and to that end my client is very content with the suggested planning condition 4, which will ensure that this is the case in perpetuity. In conclusion, the officer's recommendation to the committee is to approve the application. I commend you to vote as per that advice. Thank you.
Thank you. If you could, that's it. Thank you. Members, questions to the applicant? Councillor Robinson.
Thank you, Chair. You referred to 17 acres of other land that is available. Could you tell us what the current planning use of that land is?
I believe it's agricultural use.
Councillor Goodison.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Robinson asked the question I was going to ask.
No more questions? Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Councillor Tristan Robinson, please. Evening, Councillor. You have 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you to members for visiting the site last Friday. I'm objecting to this application for 3 main reasons. First, scale and safety. The size of this application is not suitable for the proposed use. As the Parish Council outlined earlier, the BHS standard for horses is 2 per hectare. Therefore, this site is only suitable for 3 horses if restricted turnout is used and good field management. However, the application suggests 8. The planning statement argues that the site will cater for the keeping and riding of horses. However, we know that the site can only sustain a fraction of the number of horses proposed, never mind actually riding them. The fact the planning statement proposes a use for 8 horses is more of a commercial concern rather than a private use. There is also no provision in the application for storage of equipment or security or supervision of the horses. It would be unsafe to keep 8 horses on this site, being far in excess of the BHS standards. Second, access. The access to the site is wholly unsuitable for the proposed use. 8 horses on this site would lead to a heavy increase in traffic, mainly being horse lorries and similarly large vehicles. The country roads surrounding the site are already over capacity. The access is on a blind bend and directly on the junction between Monk Sherborne Road and White Hart Lane. The only way to come out of this site is down White Hart Lane. In a large vehicle, it would not then be possible to turn left onto Monk Sherborne Road, with the right turn being blind to the driver of a large vehicle. If you exit the site the other way, you would then turn right and take a difficult right turn onto Dean's Lane and be again at a blind junction with Monk Sherborne Road. There has been no assessment of this access by the Highway Authority, which I would suggest is vital to allow members to make a full assessment of this application. The access fails policies CN9 and EM10 of the local plan. Third, lack of supporting information. There is no detail in the application regarding lighting. It would be reasonable to suggest that the applicant would want to see security lighting and similar. However, no assessment of this has been made. As Charter Alley has no street lighting currently, this would be of detriment to the village and contrary to the recently adopted Neighbourhood Plan Policy WSL6 on light pollution. Further, there is no assessment of waste, including manure generated by the horses, which presumably would be left on the site and risk polluting local watercourses and contributing to the nitrate concerns we heard about earlier. There is also no assessment of trees and hedgerows on the site. This application fails our local plan policy EM10, which is still afforded full weight. The application is not of high quality design. In fact, it is entirely unsuitable for its surroundings, and I ask you to reject it this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Members, any questions for the Ward Councillor? Nope. Thanks very much. Questions to officers? None. Debate? Councillor Nick Robinson.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a lot of concerns on this. I'm not a horse owner, but my wife is, and she would not put a horse in that field, which in itself, I think, fails EM10 2B. Is a high quality of amenity for occupants. The occupants are horses, but that is still relevant. I'm concerned about the private status of it. It is private. I think having 8 horses there with 4 families, it's effectively equivalent to a commercial use. My understanding of a private equestrian facility will be 1 family, 2 maybe at the most, but certainly not 4. So I think it fails EM10 on quite a lot of issues. I have actually listed them as 1A, 1C, 2A, 2B in particular, 2C, 2F and 2D, and therefore I propose refusal. Thank you.
Is there a seconder for the proposal for refusal? Councillor Potter. And if you wish to speak to the proposal.
I do second that proposal, Chair, and I think in particular the areas that have concerned me in regard to what we saw and what we read really are matters relating to safe access and exit from the site, having regard to the type of traffic we'd anticipate for such a facility. I don't profess, I know less than you, by the way, obviously, in regard to the keeping of horses, but I am impressed by those that do, and the recommended standards that the British Horse Society propose, I don't think should be minimised, and it just seems to me, in regard to the proposal for keeping possibly 8 horses, the site just is not adequate in that regard, and therefore I think we should have proper regard to that, and I think we're entitled to, in regard to capacity and welfare of the horses concerned. And I don't know whether it stretches it too far, but it just seems to me as well in regard to the question I raised and got answered about the surface on which these horses would be based, that it just is unsuitable in regard to the type of thousands of flints that we saw on which these horses would be treading, and I think we have proper regard to that in regard to the suitability of the site. So in support of Councillor Robinson, not that I followed every element of the sub-proposals that he was making, but I'm sure they're right, and I second the proposal to refuse this application, Chair.
Fine, I'm going to refer to officers because I think Sue needs to make a comment.
Whilst I note your concerns about animal welfare, there are no planning policies you have in your local plan or even at a national level that deal with those. The British Horse Standards are guidelines, they carry no statutory weight. There's other legislation, if there were concerns about animal welfare, that would be dealt with under. So I would advise councillors to avoid that as a reason for refusal. In terms of highway safety, obviously that is one. In terms of whether you think the design and the size of what they're proposing is appropriate to that location, equally that's another one. But in terms of animal welfare, that isn't something that I would advise you to put in as a reason for refusal.
Thank you very much. Councillor Robinson, you proposed this, and landscape, inappropriate structures in the landscape and highways. Was there anything else, bearing in mind what Sue has just said, you wanted to add to that?
Thank you. The only other thing which I omitted to say was the situation with the other 17 acres of land, which we've been told will be used to exercise the horses, which would require planning permission in itself to exercise the horses on there because it's agricultural land. It's not equine land. I'm not quite sure where that fits into local plan. A local plan quite clearly isn't written for this sort of application. But I think basically the one that interests me, and I take on Sue's comment, is 2B, where it should, hang on, 2B, let me find it, provide high quality of amenity for occupants. It's not specific whether those occupants should be animal or human. It says occupants. Horses are occupants, and horses are, to my mind, horses are as important as anybody else.
Thank you for the observation. Sue, you have another comment.
I don't disagree that yes, they are occupants of the stable, but that policy is written in the context of residential or commercial development. I remember many moons ago, we did used to actually have a policy in a very, very old local plan going back a few years that did look at animals, horses and their well-being, and that came out of our local plan probably about 2 series ago. One thing you did mention there was saying that you considered the appropriates were inappropriate structures in the landscape. That's up to you, but bearing in mind stables are something you see all the time in the landscape. Hay barns are something you see all the time in the landscape. So you may want to just reconsider the wording on how you that I wouldn't say that they're inappropriate. It might be that you take the view, for example, the amount of it, the built form or the scale of it might be unacceptable, but the word inappropriate, I don't think one is one that we would be able to justify if they went to appeal, for example.
Okay, thank you. If we can go through them one by one, I think is probably the best thing. 1A, contribute to provision of neighbourhood places which are well accessible and safe. Well, that field is not safe for keeping of horses. It's not safe for the riding of horses. So I'm content with 1A. 1C, that was a very open area of land. So putting a high-sided barn in there will not contribute to the appearance of the area. 2 and 2A, I don't think it respects the local environment. 2A, it will not contribute to local distinctiveness or the street scene. 2B, I think you are clearly advising us to leave out. 2C, having due regard to the density and scale, well, 8 horses on that size of land does not have regard to density and scale. 2D, I think we might possibly be best leaving that one out. Visually attractive as a result of good architecture. That's a little bit emotive.
Councillor Robinson, maybe we can help you out here a little bit, because I think we need to focus on the basic elements. EM1 is being suggested as probably one of the policies you want to look at, and also the highways. So we keep this down to the specific elements that we want to have included in this.
I'm more than happy to
proposal.
take advice from the officers.
I think EM10 really is when you're looking at residential development, commercial development, that type of thing. If you look at EM1, it's looking at landscape and development in the landscape. So, for example, under EM1B, it refers to visual amenity and scenic quality. And C, it's referring to important views in and out of the area. Also refers to trees in there. CN9, again, is a separate one in terms of providing safe, suitable and convenient access for all potential users. So I think you're better directed at EM1 and CN9 and separate them out into two, one for highways, the unsafe access, for example, and then EM1 in terms of the actual visual impact if you want to go down that route and the scale of the buildings, for example.
Thank you. The only reason I went to EM10 is because it was approved under EM10 in the officer's report. Sorry. However, I think you've got the gist of what I feel about this application, so I'm more than happy for you to suggest the policies that are relevant to my feelings.
So if we were to say that it's in terms of the harm to the character of the visual of the area, landscape impact, then I would say that would be EM1. In terms of safe highway access, and that's CN9.
It's been properly moved and seconded for refusal. All those in favour of refusal? That's carried for refusal. Officers? Oh, against, I beg your pardon. Any against? Abstentions? One abstention. Thank you. Officers?
Yeah, so that application has been refused due to impacts upon the character appearance of the area and the wider landscape in accordance, contrary to the requirements of policy EM1, and also in terms of the access and relationship with the highways, contrary to the requirements of policy EN9. Thank you.
Thank you, officers. Moving on to item number 6, and Catherine Mills again, please. Officers will introduce the application.
Thank you, Chairman. This application is for the demolition of an equestrian buildings and a restroom and the erection of a 2-bedroom detached dwelling. This application is recommended for refusal for the reasons set out on page 109 of the agenda. Just to draw members' attention to the update page, there's a comment received from Councillor Sanders, which is copied and repeated there. And there's also officer comment on the councillors' comments. And just to note that the officers, the comments raised by Councillor Sanders had been considered within the main bulk of the officer's report. I'm also just going to draw members' attention to the fact that this is an identical application to the one before committee on the 9th of October, as set out in the officer's report, and there's discussion within there. So just to confirm, the application is recommended for refusal for the reasons set out on page 109. Thank you.
Thank you. And you have 4 minutes.
Okay, thank you and good evening again. When this application was considered at the October meeting, repeated references were made to the importance of the previous appeal in 2016, which was dismissed in part due to the site's location. Since then, there have been 2 Court of Appeal judgments regarding previously developed land and the interpretation of the term isolation. These supersede the previous appeal decision on this site. In January 2019, the Council published a guidance note on the interpretation of policy SS6A, which reflected the judgment in Braintree, where the Court of Appeal held that the word isolated should be given its ordinary meaning as far away from other places, buildings and people, remote. The note states the Braintree definition is therefore narrower than the local plan definition, so we think that 2016 inspector's view is no longer in line with current practice, and accordingly that decision should be given little weight. The Braintree case concluded the adjective isolated is generally used to describe a location. It's commonly used in everyday English, meaning an island. It carries the ordinary sense of something that is standing apart or alone, detached or separate from other things or persons, unconnected with anything else, solitary. There are existing buildings on the site, and the neighbouring dwellings of Burley Glen and Burley Moor are evidently visible. There are more than 50 dwellings in a 500-metre radius of the site, so the site cannot be regarded as remote or solitary, particularly having regard to the fact that other places, buildings and people are not far away. The site is not isolated. It's relevant that Meadowbrook Farm is just 600 metres from the village pub and 650 metres from a bus stop. In my previous speech, I referred you to the 6 other applications approved by the Council under SS6A for new dwellings that are further away from other places, buildings and people than we have here. We note that approving an application recently for a new dwelling on an equestrian site in Penwood last month, officers acknowledged that the pattern of development surrounding the application site sits some distance from the highway and is visually and physically related to the section of Penwood. Officers concluded that that site was not isolated, even though the proposal would not be visible from the highway. It was accepted that there may need to be a need to travel, and that it would be reasonable to expect that the use of a private car in a rural location would happen. The pattern of development surrounding Meadowbrook is not dissimilar to that in Penwood, but the 2 cases are strikingly similar but been determined very differently. We point out that there is a bus service within 650 metres of Meadowbrook, which gives an option to travel more sustainably, but we think it's relevant that John and Mel currently travel to the site twice daily from their home in Highclere to tend to their horses. Private car trips will have to be significantly reduced by living on site. In terms of other planning considerations, the officer concludes that the development would correspond with what currently exists, would not result in harmful visual impacts to the right-of-way, and that the dwelling is acceptable in terms of its design and would not harm the character of the area. The proposal is said to be in accordance with policies SS6, EM1 and EM10 of the local plan.
1 minute.
However, the officer refers to the need for a garden area of 50 square metres to meet the recreational and domestic needs of the occupants. We have submitted a visual to illustrate how the proposed courtyard area would provide that requisite 50 square metres of functional amenity space. And with 1.2 hectares of land to maintain and to ride their horses, the applicants consider that their recreational and domestic needs will be fulfilled. Finally, as there is no 5-year housing land supply, paragraph 11 of the framework is engaged, and the decision maker is asked to approve applications which accord with the development plan. Applications should only be refused where the adverse impacts clearly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits. In this case, the site is not isolated, siting and design is acceptable, and the proposal does no harm. Adequate amenity space is provided, and no objections have been received, and the nearest neighbours write in support of the proposal. There are no demonstrable harm, and the benefits clearly outweigh any impacts. We therefore respectfully request that you approve the application. Thank you, and I'll be able to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. Questions for the applicant? Nope. Thank you very much. Councillor Saunders?
Good evening once again, members. I'm not going to dwell on the reasons why the application's been brought back. Mistakes happen. But what is good about it is that it provides an opportunity to put right what might have become an injustice if the original decision had been carried through. It was argued at that time that weight should be given to an earlier appeal decision on this site, despite the fact that the design has changed significantly from the earlier appeal. It's now accepted by officers that no significant harm would occur to the AONB or to the character of the area. And case law has changed the guidance on remoteness to mean far away from other places, buildings and people. Meadowbrook Farm is by no stretch of the imagination remote. It's 50 yards from the 3 adjacent buildings. That's exactly the same distance as Knight's Farm was from its adjacent buildings, the one that you've just approved. It's just 200 yards away from another 30 dwellings in the settlement of Bull Hill. And it's only 500 yards from the pub and the garage, considerably less than it was from Knight's Farm. So there's no way that it can be considered remote from Bull Hill, which is the relevant settlement, or that it is less sustainable than Knight's Farm and the adjacent site for which the planning has already been granted. Indeed, the distance from Knight's Farm down a narrow country lane to the main road is 3 times that from Meadowbrook to get to a main road. The difference with Knight's Farm is that there were objections from neighbours and the parish council. Meadowbrook has only got letters of support from neighbours and acceptance from the parish council. On all its main points, the appeal decision is therefore no longer relevant, and it was wrong to consider it last time. This application must be judged on its own merits. Reference is made in the report to a list of sites for which permission has been granted, which are also more remote than Meadowbrook. The point is made by officers that they are only a small selected sample of sites considered under SS6 since the adoption of the local plan, and therefore not representative. But the plan was adopted in 2016. The Braintree case, which redefined remoteness, was in 2018. The examples cited date post-Braintree and therefore are relevant and should be considered, which is why I asked for them to put on the update sheet. We must have consistency in the way that we approach policy, and this recommendation to refuse is not consistent with our previous practice. The issue of amenity land has already been dealt with by the applicant. I'd only add that when we consent to flats, for instance, they don't have their own individual amenity land. It's provided elsewhere. This application is surrounded by acres of its own amenity land, but not necessarily enclosed with flower beds. Our policies should not be used to force urban concepts on rural locations. But of course, our policies are now considered out of date because of the lack of land supply. Para 11 of the MPPF applies, which states permission will be granted unless harm will be done to areas or assets of particular importance and will affect the policies of the framework. This application is for one building on previously developed land which looks virtually the same as the one that's there at the moment and which is accepted as being in keeping with its surrounding. It is no more remote or unsustainable than land you've already consented to this evening and actually sits more closely adjacent to Ball Hill. So where is the harm? This site does not look remote, it doesn't feel remote, and the evidence is that it's not remote. It's in keeping with its surroundings, surrounded by acres of amenity space. Simple common sense tells you there is no way that any harmful effect would significantly outweigh the benefits of the development or that it is not sustainable. So to be consistent in our approach, and on that basis, I hope that you will consider approving this application this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Saunders. Members, any questions for the ward member? Nope. Thank you very much. Microphone, please. There you go. Questions to officers. Councillor Potter.
Can I just try this, Chair? It just seems to me really, and I remember my contribution such as it was last time we considered this, but in regard to what we've been reminded of now in terms of the Braintree decision, and clearly the clarity that I think comes from paragraph 11 of the MPPF, I mean, are we entitled to say that our existing policy in regard to SS6 is superseded and out of date in that regard, and therefore we can quite properly consider this application as it's newly presented to us and say that Braintree has an overriding implication and inference in regard to this application that's before us tonight. In other words, we are entitled to say that we are seeking now to catch up really with a policy that's changed because of case law that's been established elsewhere.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, just to clarify, the matter of the Braintree case has been covered within the officer's report on page 117. Councillor Potter is correct to say that because of the 5-year housing supply position, policy SS6 is afforded reduced weight. However, the Braintree case was in regard to the context of the word isolated in regards to the MPPF, which is also to be referred to when making decisions on applications. And the officer has set out in their report there how why they feel that this site, having regard to the court case at Braintree, why this site is isolated.
Thank you. Councillor Porter?
I'm grateful for the advice. I'm torn, I'll be frank, and I'll obviously await other comments from people already, but I think I'm moving to a position that I'll describe later.
Questions to officers we've got at the moment. Councillor George?
Thank you, Chair. Looking at the second reason for refusal, the amenity space, I think we've heard the applicant's suggestion that because it's surrounded by land in their ownership, they would therefore have access to that. Is there any reason, should this dwelling, if it was constructed, be sold on in the future, is there any assurance there that the amenity space would be available to the subsequent owner?
So yeah, I'd just refer you to the plan. So the red line of that application plan outlines the site, which is largely where the new dwelling would go, and also an area for parking. So the applicant refers to an area of amenity space immediately to the east of the new dwelling, which would meet the needs of the applicant. However, the officer in their report has set out why they don't feel that accords with our standards, in the our guidance. If the applicant was to use land within their ownership outside of that site for residential purposes, they would need to apply for planning permission to change the use of that land.
Any more questions to officers? Councillor Potter?
Just in terms of the amenity space, question stroke argument, if I can, really. I'm never sure about this. We've had a number of applications previously where, putting it on the line, the amenity space that's been offered within a design that we've been looking at is well below our SBD, and we've come to terms with that on the basis that, it's nearly catch-22. The developer puts in an application for an over-dense development within a limited site. By definition, they're not then able to provide the amenity space that is required under the SBD, but we have said, that's acceptable because of the design that's been submitted. And it's been well below on occasions, as you recall, not even space, quite frankly, for a rotary clothes hoist. In this case, it isn't quite as bad as that. In fact, a lot better than that. And we seem to be constraining ourselves in regard to this argument around amenity space in a way that we've compromised it elsewhere. I know one thing can't be compared with the other necessarily, but is the amenity space here really that unacceptable in the context of our design standards?
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, so if just draw members' attention to page 123 of the report, the officer sets out there why it's considered that the amenity space is worthy of a reason for refusal.
Thank you. Any more questions? Debate? Councillor Bound?
Thank you, Chair. I do remember this application from previously, and I'll have to lay it on the line. I considered it at the time to be in an isolated location, and I voted in that appropriate way. And I would draw the committee's attention to an application recently in my own ward where there was a single house in a road which was close to other dwellings. It had a school close by, it had a school close by, it had shops close by, it had bus stops fairly close by. And the committee thought that was in an isolated location. I consider this to be worse, and I wait to see what other people have got to say in terms of the application, but at the moment I am favouring the officer recommendation.
Waiting for debate. Councillor Robinson.
Thank you, Chair. Leaving out the Braintree case, which obviously does move the goalposts a little bit, we've heard that this is 400 yards from the local pub. And I can't remember how many yards, but it was relatively close to a bus stop. So in terms of isolation, I'm satisfied that it's not isolated. So the other reason for refusal was amenity space. And I, like Councillor Bound, I do remember going there and wandering around. And there was a large area covered in gravel, which could be used for parking. An amenity space, to me, is somewhere to sit out in the sun, maybe have a barbecue. And there was plenty of room to do that within the red line area. So I think there is sufficient amenity space. And we've heard there's no harm to the ANOB. So the two reasons for refusal, I think, are incorrect. And without those reasons for refusal, we move to presumption in favour of sustainable development. And therefore, I think this is a sustainable development. And yeah, I would propose acceptance of it, approval.
Do I have a seconder for approval? Councillor Potter for approval. And I think you've said enough for the officers to take note of the reasons for approval. Officers nodding, shaking. Yes? Been moved and seconded for this application for approval. All those in favour of approval on the basis of the two reasons. Those against? 2 against. Thank you, that's approved. Officers?
Yeah, so just to confirm, that application has been approved for the reasons set out by Councillor Robinson, that the site is not in an isolated location and amenity space provided would be sufficient to meet the needs of the owners.
Right, thank you very much. We move on to item number 7. Can I ask Councillor Davies to come forward, please? And I hope I pronounced it Davies. Davies. Ah, okay. I always get caught out. Thank you very much. You just I can sit tight and we'll introduce the application.
Thank you, Chair. This is an application. It's a permission in principle for residential development for up to 9 dwellings. If I can draw your attention to the update paper and the viewing panel report, and also some additional clarification in terms of what a PIP is, and just emphasising again that you're looking at location, land use and the amount of development. Also draw to your attention that one further letter of objection has been received and the comments that they've raised have already been addressed in the officer's report. The recommendation is for approval.
Thank you very much. Councillor Davies, you have 4 minutes and it's the button right in front of you there.
Thank you. The Parish Council object to this development on the basis of access to and from the proposed site. Access is key to determining whether the location is suitable. The applicant's planning statement comments that access could be considered for any future stage of review and should not be considered at the permission in principle stage. The Hampshire County Council Highways Officer has objected due to inability to show safe access and noted a narrow access road onto a main road at this location increases the safety risk. This demonstrates access is a key factor to the suitability of a location, and you should conclude that this is not a suitable location at this stage rather than waiting for the technical design consent stage. The proposed development borders the western boundary of the Sherburn St John Conservation Area, and access to the proposed site can only be gained through the conservation area. This shows that the location of this site is unsuitable for development in relation to the obligations in Section 72 of the Planning, Listed Buildings and Conservation Act 1990. The Parish Council object to this development due to its proximity to a number of listed buildings in this area of West End and the impact the development would have on the setting of these listed buildings as per obligations found in Section 16 and 66 of the Planning, Listed Buildings and Conservation Act 1990. The Parish Council object to this development on the grounds that it is situated in a greenfield site outside the current settlement boundary within the strategic gap and would, according to the objection from the landscape team, have adverse effects on landscape character and visual amenity contrary to policy EM1 of the adopted local plan. The content of the landscapes team objection disputes the applicant planning consultant comments that this development would not diminish the gap between Sherburn St John and Basingstoke. I therefore urge the panel to review the location of this development in line with both the Borough Local Plan, numerous policies, EM1, EM2, SS5, SS6, and give credibility to the Sherburn St John Neighbourhood Plan, specifically policy SSJ2, which was made in 2017. Both plans aim to protect the rural nature of the local village and to avoid building within the strategic gap while supporting growth in the region. The Parish Council also object on the amount of development due to the assessed need. The Sherburn St John Neighbourhood Plan was developed to assess the needs of the village with a view to contributing to the requirements of 150 new homes from the surrounding villages of Basingstoke, as set out in the Borough Local Plan, policy SS5, whilst protecting those villages from unwanted and overdevelopment. This plan identified 15 to 18 houses being required for the village, and a site for 18 new homes was agreed, has been approved at borough level and is underway at Cranes Road. The Parish Council recognise that new homes are a priority for the borough and have supported further development over and above the operational assessed need, but only when it was within the settlement boundary and on brownfield or previously developed sites. This has contributed more than 20 more new homes in addition to the 18 in the neighbourhood plan. In conclusion, I would ask that you consider this proposal on a local planning basis and not in relation to a lack of progress on agreed development in the rest of the borough. It is a risk to ignore the Borough Local Plan and Sherburn St John Neighbourhood Plan to support an unplanned, unrequired windfall development that will contribute little to the overall housing needs within the borough.
Just under 1 minute.
It will, however, significantly impact the local community which I represent, a large number of whom are present tonight, and have an irreparable impact on the rural nature of our village. I therefore request that you reject this proposal. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Members, any questions for the Parish Council? Nope. Thank you very much. And could I have Dr. Cavell and Mr. Morley, please? The microphone is on, gentlemen, and you have 4 minutes between you.
I'm Dr. Chris Cavell, and this is Major Adam Morley, representing the villagers of Sherburn St John, who strongly object to the application on the following points. The location of this proposal does not conform to SS1 of local plan or is a site identified in SS3. It is open farmland outside the settlement boundary and is part of the strategic gap referred to in policy EM2, vital to prevent the coalescence of developments. The proposal also contravenes EM1, which takes into consideration views in and out of the settlement. Similarly with policy SS6, as it does not meet an identified local need, nor is relating to the existing settlement. Access is intrinsic to this location and is from the fast and dangerous A340. The site is accessed via a narrow track bordering the conservation area, turns through a bus stop with returning traffic through the conservation area and adjacent to a number of existing properties. 5 of these are listed. The proposed exit at Dixon's Corner on the A340 is a treacherous spot on a blind corner with fast-moving traffic already heavy from the Rat Run to Marnell Park through the village, noted in the highways objection. The location of the site significantly impacts the conservation area, which forms the distinctive character of the area with the landscape and contains the corner of and borders of the proposed site on both the north and east, and in fact follows half the perimeter, including the proposed access lane, and contains both exit routes. All the properties here will be affected by noise, reduced light and denied access to the landscape. Sewerage in the village is also at capacity, especially with existing development in the village, and at peak times also copes with tankered-in waste from Monk Sherborne. The site is also designated as a DEFRA nitrate risk area. My summary argument, based on all the points I've raised and in combination with all the individual objections that you have also received, demonstrates a lack of benefits of this proposal. The contraventions mentioned to MPPF criteria reinforces the appropriateness of this proposal and hence do not represent a sustainable form of development as stated in SD1.
Chairman, committee members, on behalf of our village, I'd like to introduce one additional concern and then elaborate on a former. Firstly, proximity to listed buildings linked to EM11. The proposed dwellings will categorically overlook and overshadow a series of existing dwellings, not least that of 2 Grade 2 listed properties, 7 and 9 West End, which are only 20 metres away. This will almost certainly have an adverse impact on their visual surroundings and context, jeopardising many years of treasured impression in a highly regarded pocket of cultural heritage. Subsequently, listed building consent will be required and a legal debate will need to be had to understand the boundary between the private area of a listed building and the viewing arcs of new dwellings. Topping this off will be the need for a risk assessment on their structural integrity because they are made of chalk composites. These composites are significantly vulnerable to increased ground vibrations from construction, the movement of heavy loads, and more traffic. Second concern, access, which is intrinsic to location, linked to CN9. Joining the A340 from the non-metal track by Dixon's Garage is a death trap. The speed at which vehicles frequent the hill down the village and the power-up seen by large goods vehicles pushing up the hill at speed is intimidating. Although not always reported to the police, we suspect at least 10 vehicle incidents occur on this stretch of Tadley Road every year.
You have just under 1 minute.
Therefore, inviting more families to live on this side of the road simply presents more danger. Driving out and turning right is genuinely a horrific experience due to the hill and the blind corner, and turning left to enter the proposed development invites more opportunity for cars to come up the rear at speed. Risk is a function of magnitude and likelihood. More dwellings equal greater likelihood and therefore greater risk. Topping off, each proposed access plan uses the track by Dixon's Garage, which quite triumphantly cuts through our conservation area. The increased traffic along this track comes with noise and air pollution and greater micro ground tremor. Overlain with a backdrop of 9 new contemporary dwellings would generally have an adverse impact on the character and landscape of 1, our conservation area, 2, our protected buildings, and subsequently 3, our village. Therefore, we ask you tonight to overturn the initial planning decision and refuse this application. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Members, questions to the speakers? Nope. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Councillor Chester Robinson, please. You have 4 minutes, Councillor.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you to members for visiting the site on Friday. This application for a permission in principle is speculative, and I'm objecting to it wholeheartedly, primarily on the basis of location, a key consideration which can be taken into account for a PIP application. Members will recall that when they visited the site on Friday, they had to park up on the other side of the road, the main road. They then crossed the busy A340 and entered the site off a blind bend on this road between Basingstoke and Tadley, leading to a single track road. This access is dangerous. The Highway Authority has reviewed all potential options for the access and concluded that each and every one of them would currently be unacceptable in planning terms. The access to a site is an intrinsic consideration in the context of location. If you cannot access a site safely, it is not a suitable location. With the absence of a safe access, it is wholly unacceptable in planning terms to allow a permission in principle which, however constructed, would rely on a dangerous access. This contravenes EM10 and CN9 of our local plan. The second reason for refusing this application is proximity to the conservation area and listed buildings. The site adjoins the conservation area and is just 10 metres from Grade 2 listed buildings. The permission in principle would lead to a substantial level of harm to these buildings, contravening EM11 of our local plan, and that is intrinsic to the location of this site. Our landscape team also lodged a significant objection to the site under policy EM1 of the local plan, stating it would lead to a substantial adverse effect on landscape character and visual amenity. The site is also located within the strategic gap, which as a greenfield site contravenes policy EM2 of our local plan, with the landscape officer noting that the site adversely impacts on the character of the village with the intrusion of urbanising residential development. Sherburn St John as a village is one of our rural gems across the borough. Despite being allocated 15 to 18 homes in the local plan, Sherburn St John has in fact seen nearly 50 homes being approved in the village, 18 on the neighbourhood plan allocated site, 7 at Dark Lane, 9 at Bob's Farm, together with infill on Manor Road. Some of these applications have been supported by myself and the Parish Council because developers worked with the local community, good schemes came forward and they met local needs. We were pleased to see them developed, although not without their own contentions. The ward also sees the major strategic site in the local plan of Manydown, where there is currently a planning application for 3,400 units. This proposal is the exact opposite. It is speculative. There has been no engagement with the community, and it's rather telling that the applicant isn't here this evening to defend their case.
1 minute.
it is in an unsustainable location, relying on a dangerous access and with significant harm to heritage and landscape assets. I ask members tonight to reject this application due to it failing on location as a result of an unsafe access policy CN9 and EM10, proximity to the conservation area, an impact on listed buildings EM11, and impact on the landscape EM1. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Members, any questions to the ward member, please? Councillor Leeks.
Good evening. Were you saying a great deal about access, but you also agree that the access, what's the opposite to access? Coming out of the place? Egress. Is as bad as the access?
Yes, I think the point that it's worse is correct. You know, the access and egress to this site, in planning terms, I'm referring to access, which includes egress from the site. It is a very dangerous part of the road. You're on a blind bend on the A340, which is a major trunk road between Basingstoke and Tadley. There's a lot of traffic. You know, the residents who live there, as they mentioned, take their life into their own hands every morning. It is not a safe access.
Councillor Leeks.
I agree with you. I use that road very regularly, and it is a terrible road. Absolutely. I'm surprised there's not been more accidents.
We have questions here, Councillor Leeks, not a statement. No, that's not a question. Sorry.
I take back what I said.
Questions to the ward councillor, please. No more? Thank you very much, councillor. Questions to officers. Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Chair. In looking through the report, it's quite clear that the highways don't like this application. In the planning balance conclusions, there's no consideration given to the access, presumably because that will come up under the next stage if this were to be granted. And yet it is relevant, surely, to the location that we are considering. And I would like officer comment. If we can't, the location has to be accessed. The access, according to the highways people, is dangerous. Is that not part of the location considerations that we should be thinking about this evening?
If I could just clarify, you're looking purely at the location as putting houses on the site, not how you get to it. That comes at the technical design stage. The only reason in the officer's report that the highway officer has made comments in detail about various access points is because the applicant has submitted information as part of his application indicating where you could potentially get it. What you need to remember is if a PIP is granted, it is almost like a third of a planning permission. All of the details, the design of the houses, the scale of the houses, their location, where the access goes, they all form part of the technical detail consent stage. And it could well be that there is no suitable access for that site. And you consider that at the technical detail consent stage. That then means they don't get the full permission. So they will never ever have a permission that they can implement. So you have to look at it totally in isolation in terms of the location, the houses that could go on there, but you're not for looking at access at the moment. The county highway officer has only commented on it because the applicant has submitted it, and that's addressed on page 146 in the officer's report.
Councillor Harvey.
I'm just going to test this to see whether or not this is going to stand up. If I interpret the officer's paragraph 135 local plan correctly, we have a local plan that defines the allocated locations for development within the borough, that also within that defines both brownfield and greenfield. So we've done that piece of work as an authority. We have identified where we, within our local plan, have chosen the locations for development. Within the context of this location, it's beyond a settlement policy boundary. It is not an allocated site. It is a greenfield location in a rural setting, technically, because it's beyond a settlement policy boundary. And therefore, it would sit outside of our local plan in any consideration of its location for development. Not talking about anything else, just specifically those principles. would I be reasoned to think that I can make a judgment and come to a view based upon that simple point?
Unfortunately, no. Purely because of the situation we're in terms of our housing land supply. Therefore, any policies relating to housing, the location and where housing should go are now considered out of date because we have no 5-year land supply.
Are you saying, from an officer's perspective, that there is absolutely nothing in law, nothing in planning regulations, nothing in the NPPF that gives this committee anything that we can hang any rejection of any proposal or any PIP anywhere in this borough on because we do not have a 5-year housing land supply? Are you saying it is open season on any land? Or if you are saying there are things that we should be considering, can you help us understand, please, what are the things that we should be considering? Which is it? It's either open season or it isn't because of the 5-year housing land supply.
Right, I mean that's all addressed, to be honest, in the officer's report, going through each point in detail. So in terms of our housing policies, we still address them in our reports, but then we make it clear to you because you don't have a 5-year land supply. The borough has no 5-year land supply. They carry little weight. You then revert back up to the National Planning Policy Framework, and within that there will be things in terms of the impact on the landscape character, for example. So in terms of location, you can take the view that you consider a PIP in that location, notwithstanding the issue in terms of 5-year land supply, because of the NPPF, that there's harm to the landscape. Equally, you could take a view because of the location of it next to a listed building, which has been mentioned this evening, that might have such detrimental harm on the setting of that listed building. I would, however, say in terms of the listed building, that has been considered by our specialists in terms of the historic environment team, and they are saying that they consider that there would be no harmful impact and that you would deal with the details at the technical detail consent stage. So it's not open season. I would say not having a 5-year land supply has reduced our ability to just say no to these, and therefore we have to consider them.
Questions? Any more questions? Councillor George.
Thank you, Chair. Can I test one other one there at the moment? Because I think the strategic gap has also been mentioned, and I noticed you've said that that's not, necessarily being closed, but this area is considered to be a strategic gap. Because of the 5-year hand supply, are we saying that that is open season in strategic gaps as well, or could we potentially use that as a reason, please?
The strategic gap, you need to that policy isn't there in terms of a landscape character, visual amenity. It's purely to prevent coalescence between Basingstoke and Sherman St John or other areas. It's the officer's view, as is clear in the report, that basically it wouldn't impact on the strategic gap. It wouldn't affect the coalescence. It's not of a large enough scale, and because of where it is in relation to Sherman St John itself, it's not getting closer to Basingstoke, so you're not reducing the gap. So that's why the officer's recommendation is saying that it wouldn't have an impact on that. We wouldn't put that down as a reason for refusal.
Just supplementary on that, could I ask then, if that's the case, why is it actually allocated as part of the strategic gap if it's not going to have an impact on closing it?
I think you're looking at in terms of larger scale development and preventing that from happening.
No, any more questions to officers? Debate? Councillor McCormack.
I'm going to move refusal. It would appear that highways is not going to have any weight at this PIP stage. I have to say, it's been manifest to all of us on this committee, looking at that drawing, that it's an extremely dangerous junction. I wouldn't want to turn right out of that, especially when you've got the sweeping bend partially sighted and a road opposite. But I'm a bit nervous that if we don't give consideration to these things at the earliest possible opportunity, there might be some kind of gotcha at the later stage. You say, well, you had the opportunity and the highways people objected to it then and you still let it go through. So If it's worth listing highways as a point of objection, then I would do it. However, I don't think it is. But I think we should move it on the grounds of EM11 proximity to listed buildings and EM1 impact on views. And I would welcome any officer comment on that.
Councillor Potter.
My goodness, well, we've been here before, and without wishing to bore you, I'll say the same things. I mean, I genuinely believe, I mean, the fact of life is going to be that most PIPs, if not all PIPs, are going to occur in the rural areas. And to be frank, I think rural ward councillors and parish councillors with influence should be lobbying their MP to get this piece of legislation changed, because that's the simple fact. We've been given a bad piece of planning legislation to deal with here, and it's really very difficult, I think, for people to get in their heads the limitations that apply to PIPs, really, which we're trying to deal with this evening. I mean, I don't think I'll get many PIP applications in Popley East, where just about every piece of land's been built on already, so I can probably relax about it, and I don't know the MP anyway. But in all seriousness, the limitations that apply to us are set out in this officer report once again, and they are very limited. With respect to this argument about access, I mean, there's all sorts of assumptions that are made at this stage about where that access will be, and there's a proposition, obviously, that is reasonably based in terms of land ownership. But other accesses might be possible. There are dwellings there that could be bought up. Who knows what the future holds? There are all sorts of possibilities in the future, and therefore, you know, we can't speculate on that. It just seems to me, consistent with what Sue has said, our decision here should be limited to the location, which is clearly an available site in terms of a piece of land that could be built on, the land use itself, which currently doesn't inhibit building on it, and the amount of development, and there's no proposal for it to exceed the number of dwellings that are contained within a PIP application. It's as simple as that, and as Sue quite properly advises, all the other areas that are covered by policies that we have and conditions we might need to apply in due course will come at second and third stages in any planning application were it to go that far forward. But at this stage, this bad piece of legislation just needs to be looked at in the very limited way that we're obligated to do under those three headings and no more than that. And to be frank, I mean, I've said it ad nauseum, I know you could nearly do this off a Google map, really. You know, that's the fact of it. Does that piece of land on the Google map look big enough to get up to 10 dwellings on it? And you don't need anything else that goes with it. And I know that must irk parish councils like the one we have here tonight, but that's the limitation. Now, we either go with that, or we do what I did last time quite deliberately, and I'll do it again tonight. If that's the case, we'll refuse this, let it go to appeal, and we'll test this to the limit. But I think that's really an abdication of our responsibilities in this regard. So I do say around the table, our limitations are clear, they're set out to us, and I'm trying to comply with clearly all the advice we've had in regard to the way PIP should be approached. Anything else from that takes us beyond the limits that should apply to a PIP application.
Right. Councillor McCormick, you expressed a proposal for refusal, did you not? And the reasons for it. Do I have a seconder for that proposal? That's Councillor Robinson. I'll come back to you in a minute, Councillor. I just want to ask the officers, are you content with the proposal, but the reasons for the proposal for refusal? You are. Councillor Robinson, you want to speak to the proposal?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I am seconding this motion, and I would remind everybody of what I said, I think it was 2 weeks ago, on a PIP, strangely enough, in the same ward, that EM1 and EM11 were afforded full weight by the inspector on the Goddard's Farm inquiry at a point where we had no 5-year housing land supply. We were told those policies still had full weight because they did not exceed the terms of the NPPF guidelines. So we can legitimately refuse it on those grounds, which is why I'm seconding it. But I also think and I'm going to be a bit of a, you're going to hate me. If we refuse this, if it is voted through to refuse, I think we should put something in there about refusing it on the grounds that no viable access is there, which makes the site unviable. And as Councillor Potter has said, let's test the water to the limit.
Councillor McCormack, you're the proposer of the motion that's been suggested by your seconder. Would you take that up as the proposer?
Happy to, Chair.
Absolutely. Officers?
I think, Chairman, you've had and committee, you've had very clear advice from Sue Tarvis about what the extent of the proper assessment of this application is. I think my advice to you is that you were given initially 2 reasons for refusal, which I think are a basis for a decision. By adding in another one, which I don't think comes within the terms of PIP, as Sue has explained, I think actually runs the risk of almost weakening the decision you've made. So I think my advice to you would be you've had 2 reasons from Councillor McCormack, and stick to those, because I think that gives you a stronger position to go to appeal and provide an argument against the scheme.
Back to you, Councillor McCormack.
Well, it would be with a great deal of reluctance that I would heed that advice.
But I need a decision. Are you going to heed it and
Well,
stick
yes,
with
I
your
will,
2
yes,
original ones?
reluctantly, I will heed it. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
If it gives it a higher probability of being sustained, yes.
Been properly moved and seconded for refusal for the 2 reasons already mentioned. All those in favour for refusal? All those against? Abstentions? 1 abstention. That is refused. Officers?
Thank you, Chair. Just to clarify that the application is refused on the basis of the adverse impact on the adjacent listed buildings, contrary to policy EM1, and the adverse impact on the landscape and views of the landscape, contrary to policy EM1.
Could I ask the public to be quiet, please? We have not finished this committee. Excuse me, in the back. Can you please be quiet? We have not finished business. We have another item on the agenda. Thank you. If you would leave quietly. Thank you. If we move to agenda item number 6. And this is the quarterly planning appeals report. Officers?
Thank you, Chair. Really, it's just summarising decisions we've had. We've got Goddard's Farm on there, which I think you obviously all know about and have been spoken to about. I draw your attention on page 161, Water Bailiff's Farm. Just for your information, that was dismissed. Obviously, that was one you may recall. It came to committee. We recommended it as officers for approval, and the committee overturned that, and that's been upheld by the inspector. And then there's one other one, possibly that you may recall, page 166, 6 Churchland in Bramley. And I'm bringing out all the ones where you've overturned our recommendations for approval, and they've been one on appeal. But I would just thought I would raise those and bring them to your attention.
Members, any comment at all about any of the appeals results? And I think Sue sort of preempted any comments about the ones that we had overturned. Yeah, Councillor Potter.
That'll happen with the PIPs as well, I guess. So.
Time will tell. Thank you very much, everybody, for this evening. And we'll close the meeting at, would you believe, 8:36.